Hi, my name's Jen Lerner, and I'm with Cornell Cooperative Extension of Putnam County. We're here today because we've had a frequent question to our diagnostic lab, and that is, how do you replant an orchid? So many of you have probably purchased an orchid and enjoyed the flowers, and once they've faded, the plant may succeed and grow well, but then it comes a point where it kind of looks like an octopus with roots going in all directions. And we've invited here today Emily Tobich, who is a Master Gardener volunteer, as well as an employee of Enemy Orchids. And she's going to show you how to repot an orchid and share some of her knowledge with you.
Yes. Okay, first, what I'd like to do is show you the two different types of medium that orchids get potted in. We are concentrating on the orchid called Phalaenopsis today, the ones that I have right here. They are mostly, in our business, potted in sphagnum moss, which comes from various places, New Zealand, I think Argentina, Chile area, and it holds water more than the other type, which is bark. And this is actually a bark mixture. We've got perlite in here, and two different types of bark, and some charcoal even is in here. This holds less moisture, and it's actually hard to overwater an orchid potted in bark. But on the other hand, it'll dry out quicker, and you have to water it more frequently. So with that said, we're going to do Phalaenopsis orchid, and we're repotting it in moss. Oh, and by the way, if an orchid is potted in moss, you make sure you repot it in moss. If it's potted in bark, you have to repot it in bark, because you're changing the environment for the orchid, and you'd have to change your watering habits, perhaps where it is, the environment around it, the humidity level. So you want to keep it in the same medium that it was already in. Okay, so we have here a rather young Phalaenopsis. It's in a 2.5-inch pot, and as she said, the octopus roots are growing all over the place, and it's actually outlived this size pot. So we are going to put it in the next size up. This is a 4-inch but short pot. We have two different size pots here, and this pot would be the next size up for this. And the reason why we pot them in these type of pots, it's a very flexible pot. And in the orchid business, we make arrangements with the orchids that we send out in large pots. And sometimes you have to squeeze in many pots of orchids for a big arrangement. And these are flexible enough to squeeze them in. If you had a hard pot, you couldn't do that, and it wouldn't work for the business. So we use these flexible pots. And it's actually advantageous for watering as well, which I'll get into when we talk about that. Okay, so what I'm going to do, because I find it much easier this way, I take the moss and put it in a little tub, so you have it right there at your fingertips. You don't have to grab across the table. So now, right away, we see that we have a leftover spike, this stem. It's called a spike. And I'm going to cut that right down to the very bottom, basically where the first node is on the stem. Okay, and then I look at it and basically see the condition of the orchid. I look to see if there are any leaves that are underneath the roots growing out. If there were, I would rip off those leaves. I know it sounds harsh.
It does.
I know when people see me doing it, they say, ouch, when I'm doing that. I see another old stem here, so I'm going to cut that down as well. So I'm going to cut the pot just to get it out. Another advantage to having it potted in these flexible pots, you could just cut it out. If it was a hard pot, you'd have a little bit more of a problem with getting it out of the pot. Okay, so we have the newly orchid that wants to be in a bigger pot. So I look at to see the size of the pot based on, you know, what I have to what it's going into. As a rule of thumb, you want to have the roots, the very highest root underneath the lip of the pot. So let's say where this like first line is, the ridge line. So you want to have it inside that. So I just eyeball it. So I'm going to see what's at the bottom to get rid of. So I've got it right here. So I'm going to just pull the moss. I'm pulling the moss out. You'll see that the roots will still be there.
Okay.
And since this has been in here quite some time,
I think many people wonder if this is going to traumatize the plant.
Sometimes it does.
Okay. But
and you never know whether a plant is going to be that traumatized until you've repotted it and you set it on the bench and you wait and see. You take a wait and see, and sometimes it was just too traumatized. But I will tell you that orchids are pretty hardy, and even though you might hear strange sounds coming from crushing of roots, it's not so bad. They really can take it.
So I'm looking at it and I'm noticing that some roots are whitish, some roots are green, and some roots are brown.
Right. Well, these like greenish, bluish, grayish roots are that color because they were outside the pot. And they're looking for air outside the pot because they're grabbing the humidity in the air. So when they're inside the pot, they're more of a green or white because they have less light and more moisture. So they're a different color. Okay, so I have gotten it to where I think the spot would be to be the base of my pot. Okay, so what's left here, there's two ways you could do this. You could try to squish them all in by actually squishing them and putting them in the pot. But what I found is that actually is worse for the plant. The roots tend to die when they're wrapped around and squished like that. It's better actually to cut them. So it's like you're giving them a haircut and they'll regrow or they'll grow somewhere else and just let those roots die off. So we're going to just cut right across. Okay, so now I'm just going to double check, will this fit in? And it will. It's perfect. So I still have a lot of roots that are long. Again, I could wrap some of these around. I will do that because we have extra room in this pot. So we're going from a really small 2.5-inch pot to a 4-inch pot. So we're not really squishing the roots as much. So I'm going to wrap that one around, and then the other roots, I'm just going to put them straight down because they do the best when they're straight down. Okay, and then we stick it in, and it fits very nicely in the pot. And you see there's room on all the sides. Now we're going to add the moss around it, and I have a handy little bamboo stick that is great for doing this. You could use whatever you might have at home, but a bamboo stick works really well. And we just stick the moss in and push it down. So you could see, whoops, sticking the moss at the top and then just trying to slide it in.
So you're trying to get it in there firmly, but leave some air spaces, but not so much that it would fall out, or?
Actually, Phalaenopsis orchids like to be tightly potted in a pot. If there's too much airspace, they don't like it.
Okay.
If they start wobbling around in it, they don't like it at all. The roots will start to die off. They really like to be
Swaddled.
Swaddled, perfect, perfect. But also, one of the reasons is when you have the moss right on top of those roots and they're tightly packed in, those roots are getting the maximum moisture.
Okay.
All right. So, it's harder to do it backwards for me, but I'm going to try my best. I usually have it facing me.
And it looks like it's so firmly in there that there's really no chance that it would accidentally fall out of that pot.
That is correct. Yeah, when I am potting up an orchid, and people that I work with happen to walk in, they're like, "How are you adding all that moss?" Like, you think it's done, but then I add more, and they're like, "How? How could you add more?"
Is there any rule of thumb as to how many leaves you leave behind?
There's a rule of thumb as to, if you're asking me, how many leaves minimally does it need
Yes.
when repotting? 4 is a really good number.
Okay.
I have done it and left 3, but that's in superb conditions that we have in the greenhouse. I wouldn't recommend you do that in your own home.
Good point. A little more challenging.
Yeah.
Wow, yes, you're still fitting it all in there.
Yes, I am. I'm going to go a little bit quicker now, just for the purpose of getting to the next pot. And again, I am trying to pack it in, get it firmly packed in, but leave space at the top for watering and for more root growth. And sometimes especially if you have this orchid at home and the roots start climbing out of the pot, you can actually guide them in.
Okay.
And make them kind of go even around, if you can do that, at home. So another good reason why not to pot it so high up, like right up above the leaf, like you don't want to do that. Okay, so this little guy now, putting the tag back in, this is going to be an orange-yellow orchid. It's actually a Dorydenopsis, which is the colored type of Phalaenopsis. Most Phalaenopsis are white. So when they're a color, they're usually a Dorydenopsis.
Okay.
So there it is. It's happy in its new home, and it looks so much better than it did.
Nice haircut.
Yeah. Okay. So next, we're going to move on to the larger one. And this is what I work with all day long.
That has a lot more than 4 or even 6 leaves. It's got a lot of leaves.
A lot of leaves. First thing I'm going to do, I'm going to cut off that last spike all the way down as far as I can go. And this one's a perfect specimen to show you that there are leaves growing under the roots, or I should say, roots growing above the leaves. So with that, we don't want that. So we take out the leaves.
Now, can you use a pair of scissors to do that? Because you're doing it, you clearly have experience. Can you use scissors to cut those off, or is it better to pull them off?
No, you want to get them all out.
Okay.
Then, it's not going to kill it, but you'll leave rotting material in your newly potted plant, and it's not a good idea. So
because I know I, for one, would be a little hesitant to
do this.
To do that, yeah. So
Everybody is.
okay.
Even the people I work with, when they walk through and they see me doing that, ow, ow, they say. Okay, so now we've gotten rid of the leaves that were below the roots. So again, you can see the color of these roots. They're outside the pot. They're like a green, blue, gray. And then there's also this dead one here. I cut that right off. All right, so I'm going to cut this pot like I did the first one. Now this has a really good root system. This is a very mature plant. This has been around for a while. I could probably guess it's been around for maybe 4 years in its mature size pot. It's in excellent condition because if you look at the roots are healthy. There are not a lot of brown roots. It's a really good orchid.
Okay.
All right, so now the thing to know when you're repotting the orchid into the same size pot, the top of your orchid will probably be larger than the bottom because the rim is bigger than the base. So right away off the top, you got to get rid of the top because it'll never fit back in here the lower it gets into the pot.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
I think that a lot of us, when we were repotting things, are thinking that we're going to pot them to the next size up. Under what situations would you choose to put it in the same size pot like this?
Well, in the instance of the 2.5-inch pot, that was a baby. That was just started not long ago. So it's growing, it's growing, it's growing. It needed to go into a bigger pot. That's just the way the orchids have a quick growth in the beginning. These, would you want to put this in a bigger size pot? You really don't need to.
Okay.
Why we don't is because we try to keep them this size because we want to put them in arrangements. Right. And it's harder to do bigger pots in the arrangements. People want
got it.
Sometimes 6 orchid pots in a very large pot,
Okay.
But again, also going up to a bigger pot when it's not ready to go into a bigger pot, usually there's too much moss then, and it could be overwatered more easily because there's not enough roots to sustain all that water,
Right.
So you're in effect drowning the
Soaking
roots
it.
because there's so much moss and not enough plant.
Okay.
So we want to keep it in the same size pot. All right, so I'm going to take off this top because it's bigger, as I said. Just going to...
And you don't reuse any of that moss?
No, you wouldn't want to, just in case, for various reasons. Insects, mold, mildew.
Sure.
Because very often we will see moss growing on the side. When I cut off this, there could be moss growing on the side.
Okay. So
on the inside. Not this moss, green moss.
Algae and other mosses, not the desirable kind.
Yeah,
okay.
right. Plus, I mean, if by chance, you would hope that this doesn't happen, but if by chance you had an infestation in your house of mealybugs, which are totally, one of the worst offenders to orchids, they could be hiding in the potting medium. So you don't want to take that chance, so you get rid of everything it was in, you start fresh, give it a new life.
Spring cleaning, so.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, so I'm doing the same thing, taking the pot, looking where that root is, the highest root, well actually it's this one right here, where it is on the stem. So this one I have to actually take away half of the potting material for this orchid, which is not uncommon. So I'm going to go right in like I did before. And I'm sticking my thumb through the moss. I'm kind of, not really hurting the roots at this point. I'm just trying to get my finger through. And what happens a lot of times, I soaked both of these before I came, so it would be easier for me to take it by hand. If this was a very dry orchid, the sphagnum moss actually becomes like cork, and it's very difficult to take apart by hand.
Okay.
I mean, I've done it where I stick a scissor through it because it was so dry and like cork-like. You never want to repot it like that. You want to soak it so that you can repot it easily.
Okay, that's soft and moist.
See, now you got yellowing roots.
So, okay, so you are seeing some dead roots in there, some of the older roots that were inside.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, the orchid roots are very interesting. I have seen in my line of work here a root that starts out looking like this, and from, let's say, from this point to this point where it's that light color, it looked dead, and then picked up again alive.
Right.
The reason being is if you look at these thin filaments, that is actually the root. That is keeping this orchid alive.
Okay.
These filaments.
And that corky stuff that on the outside is just...
It's part of the root too. It takes in the moisture, but this can die off, and this could still be alive in the middle. That's why sometimes I'll see you have a green part, a dead part, and then alive again.
Okay.
And you wonder, how is that possible? Right. It's because of the filament inside.
Keeping it alive.
Keeping it alive.
Okay.
All right, so I've done the same thing I did on the smaller pot. I'm going to double check where I am. Sometimes I have to take off a little bit more, and I want to take off just a little bit more with this. All right, so like I did with the other one, it's okay to cut through the roots. So I'm going to do that with this because it has a lot of roots, and I'm going to get rid of a little bit more of the moss because I said it needs to get a little bit shorter. The roots will actually be fine and actually less traumatized than if you wind it around the whole plant.
Okay.
Okay, and I'm going to do the same thing with the new roots for this plant.
Wow.
Again, this is a very hardy orchid. We just saw the great root system that it had. So this orchid should be fine and can get through the trauma easily. Okay, so now I have my pot, and I'm going to just squeeze it in there.
Now, a lot of times people who are doing this on their own may not be able to get a pot like this. They may be finding pots at a store that have little perforated holes in them.
In the bottom.
Or sometimes the holes are on the side, and they're called an orchid pot. Would you recommend that kind of pot for Phalaenopsis?
Those are like clay pots.
Clay pots with holes in the side, right?
Clay pots, they're fine. Clay pots are porous. They have good airflow, but they do dry out quicker. Mm-hmm. That's fine. What I found personally is that the orchid pots during the summer months, if I put them outside, they will dry a lot quicker than I can water them.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So I don't like to use them outside, but indoors they're fine. Again, when you water them, the water can come out of it through the holes in the orchid pot.
Okay.
And you'd have to have, a nice size, what do you call those? The
saucer?
Saucer, thank you.
Yeah, no.
Underneath, because, normally the hole is right down there.
Gotcha.
So in the saucer, it's just going to go right down. But if you have the holes on the side as well, it's going to go on the sides, and you just have to make sure that your furniture doesn't get
Right.
Okay, so I push this down pretty much as best I can. I have found that sometimes it's very hard to get them into the pot, especially when you're going from the same size orchid to the same size pot. I mean, same size. We didn't change up to a bigger size pot. It's hard because they're pretty well established. They've got a nice base of roots here. The moss is pretty well encasing the roots, or the roots are encasing the moss. Either way, they're together and very difficult, as you saw, to take apart. So by the same token, it's hard to get it back in the pot. So this is actually a corkscrew, but I find it to be very helpful for me because it has a good surface area on the top for my palm and a decently large area on the bottom, bigger than the bamboo stick, to press it down. What I found is the bamboo stick will go straight through and come out the other side. We don't want that. We just want to press it down as much as we can to the bottom of the pot. So
wow.
see it right down.
Like a shoehorn, but
something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, so whatever you can find. This was what I found at home, and it works for me. Okay, so that looks pretty good. And you see the root is underneath the pot. Now we're going to, with the difference between putting the moss in that pot and this pot is this is already filled at the bottom. That was smaller, going into a bigger pot. So we had to put the moss all along the side.
Okay.
This we don't need to. It's already there. I mean, there might be a little bit that we might add, but I just totally go to town. Sometimes there's junk in these mosses.
Well, they're natural materials, so there can be all kinds of things in there, right?
Oh, yeah. So my thumb goes down a little further in spots, and that's fine. And if I want, I could use this just a little bit. Not that necessary. Oh, another good feature of these pots for us, besides being able to put them in arrangements, you can see the roots and everything. So when we look at a plant and you say, oh, this plant isn't doing too well, Emily, what's going on with the plant? I look right away, I could see the roots and what's going on. So they're really good, to have as a orchid pot and then put it in another pot. You just pop it right into a ceramic pot or
a cash pot, just a decorative pot, and this is the growing pot.
Yep.
Wonderful.
Again, you could see how I'm pressing it down, and my thumbs keep going down. You think I had a lot of moss in here, but I'm going to add some more.
It's very compressible, right?
Yep.
But that's also one of the abilities that allows it to absorb moisture and maintain air spaces. So the roots are getting both air and moisture, right?
Yep. Okay, so
Awesome.
So this looks so much better and happier. And I left a little space again for watering and for root growth at the top. So there you have it. It's very happy now.
Great.
Okay, now, one thing I want to talk about is watering. The biggest offender to orchids is overwatering. I can't stress this enough. What we tell people is you water it only when it needs it. How do you tell when it needs it? You put your finger into the potting medium, whatever you have. If you feel moisture, hold off and come back to it another day. Because, once a week is okay, but I personally don't have to do it once a week. I check with my finger to see if there's any moisture in there, because if there's still even a little bit of moisture, because it dries out on top first. So that's why it's better to stick your finger down into it. If I feel a little moisture down here, that means the roots have enough moisture for their processes.
Right.
So you don't want to drown the orchid roots.
So you can kill them with kindness,
Oh.
essentially.
Yes, people think that they're doing a great thing. I water it every week. And, how much water are you putting in? That's another thing. People will, put like a ton of water in it. Rule of thumb, I do 4 ounces for a 4-inch pot, this size, which is a little bit shorter.
Okay.
This size, you can do 4 to 6 ounces.
And it depends upon how much light they're receiving, how much humidity is in the air. You may not be able to give a recipe for how often to water, but how much you kind of have an idea for.
Yes.
Okay.
And we should put the orchid, a Phalaenopsis I'm speaking directly at, in a very bright, sunny location, either south or west, but indirect light. So if you're putting it near a window, you want to do like a foot from the window, or even 2 feet. You don't want to put it right up on the sill. That's way too much light. You'll burn the leaves. You'll kill the roots. It's just too much. They can't handle that. On the other hand, if you have a low light area, they could actually withstand the low light better than they can withstand the bright light.
Okay.
So
you may temporarily enjoy them when they're flowering in a low light area, but then at some point when the flowers are, when you're not really enjoying the look of it at that point, move it somewhere where they can get
Yes.
brighter light? Okay.
You can do that, yeah. Also, just a little bit of info here. So that orchids can bloom all year long for us to sell, we actually force them to spike. And the way that you can force an orchid to spike is by putting it in an area where you have cooler temperatures. So like in the summer, nothing's really that cool.
Right.
But in our greenhouse, we have an area that has a cooling wall, and we put them near the cooling wall, so then they will start to spike. And then once they start to spike, then they can go into their normal environment.
So a spike is that little flower stem that comes up from the side.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great.
So
May not be the easiest thing for us to do at home. We might have to depend upon seasonal variations to give us that.
right. But they do tend to flower more in the winter because you do have the
Cooler temperature.
Yeah.
Ah. Well, we do want to also thank Venemy Orchids for providing the orchids themselves and the mixes today so that we could do this demonstration, and Master Gardener volunteer Emily Tobich for sharing her knowledge with us.
You're welcome.
And we hope to have this video also available on our website in a few weeks. So more information to come soon. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.